Hundreds of horses died every single winter in the lumber camps of the American North. Not from disease, not from the cold, though the cold killed plenty of men too. They died because a sled loaded with timber, once it started down a hill of solid ice, did not stop. Across Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the deep woods of Maine, men built entire highways out of frozen water on purpose, loaded them with more weight than any road has a right to carry, and prayed the hill stayed kind. Then came something worse than a horse that could bolt. A 19-ton steel monster with a boiler full of fire, tracks borrowed from no machine that had ever existed before it, and exactly 0 ways to brake. It could drag 300 tons of logs down a frozen grade at 20 miles an hour, and the only thing standing between that load and disaster was one man, exposed on a tiny platform out front, gripping a steering wheel with hands that had long since stopped feeling cold. This is the story of the frozen logging road, quite possibly the deadliest delivery route in American industrial history, and one almost nobody outside the North Woods has ever heard of. For roughly 5 decades, from the 1870s into the 1920s, across Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Maine, this was how America got its lumber out of the forest and into the world, on ice, in the dark, with no way to stop. Before we're done, you'll stand on a Michigan overlook that still carries the name of a man who never made it to his own wedding. The question driving this whole story is simple. How do you build a road out of something that melts under your boots, haul a fortune in timber over it, and keep your men alive doing it? The honest answer for the better part of 50 years is that you mostly didn't. And the machine men eventually trusted to fix the problem turned out to be even less forgiving than the horses it replaced. A fact we'll come back to more than once before this story is finished. The forest that ate the old way. Picture the upper Midwest in the 1870s. White pine standing in stands so thick they blotted out the sun. Worth more standing in Michigan and Wisconsin than gold buried in California. Entire fortunes were being built on timber that hadn't been cut yet. These weren't ordinary trees. A single white pine could stand 200 feet tall and weigh more than a freight car, and felling one rawl, misjudging the lean, missing the notch, standing in the path of the swing, could kill a man before the trunk even finished falling. The problem was never the wood. The problem was getting it out. And getting it out alive. For decades, the answer was rivers, the cheapest and oldest solution available. Cut the trees in winter when the ground froze hard enough to hold a man and a horse, drag the logs to a riverbank, stack them in towering piles called cold decks, and wait for spring. When the thaw came, the logs went into the current in a screaming, grinding mass, and men called river drivers leapt out onto the floating timber to break up jams before the whole load wedged into a log jam that could swallow a town's worth of wood, and sometimes a man with it. A driver who slipped between 2 grinding, rolling logs in fast current had almost no chance at all. River driving killed its own share of men every spring, long before a single steam engine entered this story. But rivers only ran where rivers ran. The richest stands of pine sat miles back from any navigable water, and as the easy timber along the banks disappeared, loggers had to push deeper into country no river touched. That was the antagonist of this whole story. Distance. Millions of board feet of standing wealth locked behind forest with no road that could survive a single thaw cycle, no railroad spur for 100 miles, and a financial clock ticking. Every single winter a tree wasn't cut. Drag those logs over bare, unfrozen ground, and you didn't just slow the operation down, you risked snapping chains under sudden strain, burying men under shifting loads, and crippling horses on terrain that gave way under their hooves. Distance wasn't inconvenient. It was lethal. So the loggers built their own roads, out of ice. Crews packed snow into ruts the width of a sled runner, then iced them solid with water hauled from the nearest lake. The frozen ruts cut friction so completely that a team of horses could drag a load of logs that would have buried them in summer mud. Before this innovation, moving heavy timber any real distance over land was close to impossible. After it, a team of horses could pull stacks of logs 12 feet high for miles across the same iron-hard ice. It was a brilliant fix. It was also, though almost nobody saw it this way at the time, a trap with the same shape as the problem it solved, because a surface engineered to have almost no resistance going forward has almost no resistance for stopping either. The industry had just traded one danger for another and called it progress. It worked. For a while, it worked beautifully. But it ran entirely on horsepower, and horsepower had limits a machine didn't. By the 1890s, lumbermen were losing animals at a rate that horrified even men used to losing things in the woods. Hundreds of horses were killed or injured every single winter by sleds that got away from them on the downhills. And we'll get to exactly how, and exactly how many, later in this story. For now, understand this. The industry was bleeding money and animals at the same rate, and it was looking for anything that could replace a horse's legs with something that couldn't panic. That search led to a self-taught blacksmith and millwright from Waterville, Maine, named Alvin Orlando Lombard. He'd grown up working sawmills along the Penobscot and Kennebec rivers from boyhood. By the time a Kennebec lumberman named E.J. Lawrence challenged him in 1899 to build something that could replace a logging team, Lombard already had a reputation for solving problems other men had given up on. All kinds of machinery, anything mechanical that needed fixing. What Lombard built had no precedent. A steam boiler mounted on sled runners up front for steering, and at the rear, instead of wheels, a pair of continuous tracks, articulated steel treads that spread the machine's enormous weight across the snow instead of sinking into it. Nobody had ever made that work at this scale before. He named the prototype Mary Ann, and on Thanksgiving Day, 1900, he fired her up for the first time. Would she even move? That was the first question every man standing in that Maine snowfield was asking. The answer, at first, was almost worse than no. Mary Ann's tracks gripped the snow just fine. The trouble was, she had a tendency to simply rock in pace, hopping rather than rolling forward, like a beast straining against a leash that wasn't there. For a machine meant to drag hundreds of tons of timber for miles, a machine that couldn't move in a straight line was barely a machine at all. Lawrence had bet money and reputation on Lombard's idea. Standing in that snow, watching his investment buck like a stuck animal instead of pull, he had every reason to assume he'd back to failure. Lombard went back to the problem. He adjusted the gearing, refined the track tension, reworked the relationship between the engines driving each side, and got her rolling. By May of 1901, he had a patent. By the time the first production machines went to work near Eustis, Maine, lumbermen who'd spent their whole careers calculating loads in terms of horse teams were suddenly being told one machine could replace 60 animals at once. The public reaction was somewhere between disbelief and superstition. Picture a Maine winter night, dead silent except for wind in the pines, and then a sound like a freight train that had wandered off its rails and into the forest, hissing steam, clanking iron, a whistle that carried for miles across frozen lakes. Lumberjacks who'd never seen anything mechanical bigger than a crosscut stood at camp doors, listening to log haulers running through the dark, and some of them swore the woods themselves had started to growl. Some big operations ran 3 machines in rotation, and on a still night you could hear half a dozen of them calling to each other across the timber. They'd built the beast. It moved, It pulled. It worked exactly as promised on flat ground. But Lombard and every lumberman who bought one of his machines was about to discover that flat ground was the easy part. The real test of this thing wasn't whether it could pull 300 tons of logs. It was whether anyone could stop it once it started moving downhill. 19 tons of steel, 0 brakes. Here is what a Lombard Steam Log Hauler actually was. A 19 to 20-ton machine, roughly the size and shape of a small steam locomotive, built around a 90-horsepower boiler, a pressurized vessel of scalding steam that, if it failed, could scald or kill the engineer and fireman crouched right beside it. Up front, a pair of steel ski-like runners for steering. At the rear, the tracks, chain-driven, articulated, spreading the machine's crushing weight wide enough not to punch through snowpack, and powerful enough that a man caught between those tracks and the snow would simply be ground under without the machine slowing down to notice. A crew of 4 ran the whole operation. An engineer and fireman in the cab tending the fire and the throttle, a conductor riding back along the sled train inspecting couplings, and out front, alone, exposed to the open air, the steersman. Hitched behind the hauler a train of sleds, 3 to start with, eventually as many as 8, occasionally stretched to a recorded 24, a procession of timber more than a quarter-mile long. That length mattered for one brutal reason. The longer the train, the more weight a steersman was steering blind. And the more places along that quarter-mile a coupling could fail, a log could shift, or a man riding the load could lose his footing with no one close enough to help in time. Each train could carry anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 board feet of lumber. Under good conditions, a single Lombard could move 300 tons in one haul. That is the rough equivalent of 60 fully loaded horse teams replaced by one machine that never tired, never spooked, and could run 24 hours a day if the operators kept the boiler fed, and never, under any circumstances, felt the danger it was hauling toward. The chain of operation was brutally simple to describe and brutally hard to survive. Wood or coal burned in the firebox. The fire boiled water into steam. Steam pressure drove the pistons turned the gearing spun the tracks, and the tracks bit into packed snow to drag a train of timber forward. Every link in that chain ran at roughly 90 horsepower, around the clock, in temperatures that could crack ordinary castings, and every link of it depended entirely on a steersman up front, making split-second corrections with a wheel that took a full turn just to begin to respond. A machine like this cost real money, money most individual lumberjacks would never see in a decade of wages. A typical steam Lombard ran about $5,500 in the early 1900s, somewhere north of $150,000 today, and that was before you bought the specialized sleds it needed, sold by Lombard himself, because ordinary sleds couldn't survive the loads a steam hauler put on them. But none of that power meant anything without a road built specifically to carry it, and that road had to be made from scratch, every single night, out of ice. This is where the machine's design and the brutal logistics of frozen road engineering fused into one impossible problem. Crews built the roadbed first, packed snow shaped into parallel ruts exactly the width of a sled runner. Then came the sprinkler sled, a wooden tank mounted on its own runners, filled by hauling water up from a lake through a hole chopped in the ice, hauled along the route every single night, water bleeding out through plugged holes in its base to freeze solid in the ruts by morning. Drawing that water meant working at the edge of an open hole in lake ice in the middle of a winter night, slip in wet clothes at 20 or 30 below, and a man's odds of climbing back out before the cold finished him were not good. Men nicknamed road monkeys walked ahead of the sprinkler, straightening the grooves and packing snow into low spots by hand on roads that would soon be carrying 300 tons of timber over the exact ground they were kneeling on. One Maine operation maintained a single iced haul road 6 miles long this way, every night, all winter, with a telephone line strung along it to coordinate sled traffic in the dark. Why go to all that trouble? Because ice cut friction to almost nothing, which was exactly the problem. A frozen rut smooth enough to let a machine move 300 tons with ease was also smooth enough to make stopping that same 300 tons essentially impossible. There's a reason later engineers studying ice as a road surface developed strict rules about exactly how long a heavy load could sit in one place before the ice beneath it began to weaken and crack invisibly from underneath. Leave a load too long on a frozen crossing, and the ice can simply give way without warning. The lumbermen running these roads had no engineering formulas for any of this. They had decades of hard-won instinct, a lot of dead horses to learn from, and very little margin for getting the read wrong. And here is the detail that should make your stomach drop. A Lombard log hauler, fully loaded, had no brakes. None. Not on the machine, not on a single one of the sleds behind it. The only way to slow the whole train going downhill was to throw the engine into reverse and hope the tracks bit before momentum won. Or to have a man stationed on the hill ahead shoveling sand into the ruts by hand as the train roared toward him. Could the steel hold up under that kind of strain? Early machines didn't always answer that question well. Castings cracked in extreme cold. Gearing failed under sudden loads, and Lombard spent years refining metallurgy that simply hadn't existed for this application before. But the deeper vulnerability wasn't the steel. It was geometry. Every logging road, no matter how carefully surveyed, eventually had to go downhill, and every downhill turned this entire machine, engine, sleds, men, into 300 tons of cargo, with nothing underneath it but frictionless ice and gravity. Lombard wasn't the only one chasing this idea. Under license from his patent, the Phoenix Manufacturing Company of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, built a similar machine, nicknamed the Centipede, running it through the timber country of the western Great Lakes on the same brutal mathematics. Enormous pulling power, and the same complete absence of any way to make 300 tons of moving steel simply stop. We'll come back to how that rivalry played out. On paper, the system was elegant. Steam power doing the work of 60 animals, ice roads maintained with almost industrial precision, telephone lines coordinating traffic in the pitch dark. But elegance on paper and survival on a hillside were two very different things. The gearing was brilliant. The ice roads were a genuine engineering achievement. But the whole arrangement had one vulnerability nobody could design their way out of, and it was about to define what it actually felt like to work this machine for a living. The men who rode the ice at 40 below. Ask what broke down constantly on a Lombard hauler, and the honest answer is almost everything. Sprung couplings, cracked castings in deep cold, gearing that needed constant adjustment, a boiler that demanded 4 solid hours of fire just to build enough pressure to start a morning's run. Keeping one of these machines on the road took a small crew of mechanically minded men working around the clock. But the part of the job that broke men, rather than machinery, was the steering platform. The steersman sat, or more often crouched, on an open bobsled rig bolted to the very front of the machine, directly ahead of the boiler and directly beneath the smokestack. He had a heavy iron steering wheel, roughly 18 inches across, geared so stiffly it sometimes took a full turn just to begin shifting the runners. He had no roof in most models, no walls, nothing between his body and a Maine winter that could reach 40 degrees below zero. And he had this for company. Every gust of wind that caught the stack wrong sent sparks and hot cinders straight back into his face, occasionally setting his own clothing on fire. Some men who could afford it bought fire-resistant leather gear specifically for this job. Everyone else just moaned to feel for the smell of their own coat starting to smoke. A few haulers were eventually fitted with a small roofed shelter over the steering platform. It sounds like mercy. It wasn't entirely. That same roof, loggers quickly realized, made it harder for a steersman to jump clear if the train derailed or a sled broke loose. And jumping clear, more than any skill with the wheel, was often the only thing that kept a man alive. Frostbite was simply part of the uniform, a steersman's hands gripping bare iron for hours at a stretch in temperatures that could fall to 40 below, went numb fast and stayed that way for the length of a shift, so a man often couldn't tell whether his fingers were merely cold or already freezing solid. Camps lost men's fingers and toes to the cold every winter the same way they lost horses to the hills, quietly, routinely, treated as an ordinary cost of the season. A man who lost feeling in his hands at the top of a downgrade had to trust muscle memory to find the wheel at all, because by the time real pain returned to warn him something was wrong, the damage was usually already done. So what did lumberjacks call this job? They didn't dress it up. Steering crews who refused to bail out on a bad downgrade earned a name that stuck: stay with her men. And the loggers who used that phrase meant it as the highest compliment they had, because the alternative, jumping, was its own kind of dangerous gamble, timed against a moving train of log sleds that could just as easily run a man down on the way past as let him escape clean. Behind the steersman, in the open cab, the engineer and fireman worked the throttle and kept the boiler fed, swearing at each other over the noise, each one half watching the tracks turning beneath them and half listening for trouble up ahead. Further back, riding the logs themselves, the conductor inspected couplings and communicated with the cab crew through a bell rope strung the length of the train. And if a coupling pole snapped on a curve, which happened, the unhitched sleds behind him simply kept going, straight off the road and into the brush, and the conductor's only option was to jet for his life before they took him with them. And then there were the road monkeys and sprinkler crews, the men whose entire job was managing down hills nobody had figured out how to break. Picture a man running ahead of an oncoming sled train with an armful of hay, hurling it into the ruts to slow the load just enough, but not so much that the sled stuck dead on the hill, because a stuck sled stranded high on an exposed slope in 60 below weather was its own kind of death sentence, leaving men and horses trapped in the open while someone went for help. On one Minnesota operation, a road monkey named George Morrison made this exact judgment call every single day, because too little hay meant the load overran the team, and too much meant the sled sat dead until daylight. The horse teams that still worked alongside these machines faced their own version of the same nightmare. Teamsters perched 8 feet up on a roller behind their animals, unable to safely jump, unable to walk beside a moving load on a downgrade, stomping their feet against the cold because there was nothing else to do with them. In the fall and early winter, when lake ice was still thin, teams were hitched at the very end of the pole, specifically so the horses wouldn't drown if a sled broke through. And loads did break through, dropping straight into the lake, forcing crews to chain the timber and the gear back up out of the water by hand, in the dark, in clothes that froze stiff the moment they came out wet. One camp clerk remembered crews coming back so late and so soaked that nothing but cold beans were left waiting for the half-frozen rescue crew. How long could a man last doing this kind of work, season after season? Long enough to grow old in the trade, if he was careful and lucky in roughly equal measure. Veteran teamsters were prized for exactly that combination. Men who'd learned to read a hill before it taught them the hard way, who knew which downgrades needed a starter team hitched on early and which ones could be trusted to a single 4-horse rig. Some teamsters started driving 4-horse logging sleds in their early teens, trusted with rigs that could kill an experienced man in a heartbeat if the load got away. For months at a time, this entire system somehow held together. The road stayed iced. The sled stayed on the rails of frozen ruts. The hauler's whistle cried out across frozen lakes every night, and men went home in the spring with their pay and most of their fingers. But most of the time is not the same as every time. And every single one of these jobs, steersman, conductor, road monkey, teamster, was one bad hill away from becoming the next name carved into a story nobody in camp wanted to tell twice. The hill they named after a dead man. Start small, the way these things usually did. A coupling pole would crack on a turn, and a string of sleds would lurch sideways into the brush while the conductor scrambled clear with seconds to spare. A road monkey would misjudge his hay throw and watch the load slide past him faster than a man can run. A steersman would feel the wheel go light and useless in his hands on a grade he'd run clean 100 times before, and have half a second to decide whether this was the time to jump. These were the near misses, the stories men told around the bunkhouse stove afterward, with their hands shaking just slightly more than the cold could explain. And every camp had a few veterans who could tell you exactly which downgrade had nearly killed them and exactly which year. Then it escalated. Hundreds of horses were killed or injured every single winter by runaway sleds on these ice roads. Not as some rare catastrophe, but as a routine accepted cost of doing business in the timber industry, year after year, region after region. A team could gallop just fast enough to try to stay ahead of an unbraked load bearing down behind them. But a horse has nowhere to dodge to on a road cut narrow through standing timber. When hay and sand failed to slow a sled in time, the load simply ran the team down from behind, and there was no mechanical failsafe anywhere in the system to stop it. Multiply that scene across every logging region in the North, every single winter for decades, and you understand exactly why the industry gambled everything on an unproven steam contraction nobody had ever seen work. The men who drove the era's other dangerous transport, the high-wheeled log carts used in summer logging across Michigan and Wisconsin, faced a near-identical problem on dry ground instead of ice. The earliest big-wheel carts had stiff tongues and absolutely no braking system at all. On a downgrade, a loaded cart could overtake its own team in seconds. A safer design already existed by then. We'll get to why it didn't save everyone. The Phoenix centipedes back in Wisconsin's timber country were losing steersmen to the exact same downhill math at the exact same time for the exact same reason. Proof, if anyone in the industry still needed it, that the danger here was never about one company's engineering. It was built into the whole idea of moving unbraked weight over a frictionless road, no matter whose name was painted on the boiler. And on the morning of May 20th, 1910, that danger came for one logger in particular. His name was Samuel Graxick, 23 years old, known to every man in his logging crew as Big Sam. By every account, he was well-liked, hard-working, and engaged to marry his childhood sweetheart. That morning, working the steep ridges above the Jordan River Valley in northern Michigan, Sam was driving a team of horses pulling a big-wheel cart loaded with logs down a slope his crew had worked 100 times before. Something gave. The cart broke free of control on the grade. The team couldn't outrun it, and it ran over him. There was no warning anyone could point to afterward, no obvious mistake to blame. Just the same downhill math that had already claimed hundreds of horses, finally claiming a man instead. His friend and fellow logger, Anthony Wugikowski, was the one left to carry the story back to camp, and the one whose account is the reason we still know exactly how it happened. Sam never made it to his own wedding. His official cause of death is recorded with brutal, bureaucratic simplicity. Run over by wheels loaded with saw logs. Killed in the woods. Accidental. That overlook above the Jordan River Valley still carries his memory in its name today, Dead Man's Hill. Though over the decades the historical sign at the site has remembered him, slightly incorrectly, as Stanley. Whatever name history settled on, the hill remembers what the job actually cost. Could anything have saved him? In a narrow mechanical sense, yes. And that's the cruelest, most frustrating part of this whole story. Engineers had already begun developing a slip-tongue braking system for big-wheel carts by the time Sam died, a design that used the load's own forward creep on a downgrade to drag a brake into the ground automatically, no driver intervention required. It was a genuine, life-saving innovation, born directly out of exactly the kind of accident that killed Sam. But innovations like that spread through a scattered regional industry, slowly, cart by cart, camp by camp, and plenty of crews kept running the older, brakeless, stiff-tongue carts for years after a safer design existed. Was there ever a public outcry to match the private cost? Not in the way later industrial disasters generated headlines and government hearings. Logging deaths in this era rarely made front-page news outside their own region. They were absorbed into camp folklore, into hillsides that earned grim nicknames, into a body count nobody in the timber industry was keeping with any real precision. There was no single catastrophic accident that shut the whole system down overnight. No spectacular collapse, no famous inquest. The reform came slowly. Instead, in scattered pieces, breaking innovations on big wheels, refinements to log hauler gearing and steering, and eventually, the broader rise of workplace injury law and workmen's compensation systems across American industry in the 1910s, which finally began putting a financial cost on what had previously been treated as simply the price of working in the woods. What never changed, through all of it, was the basic physics nobody could engineer away. A frozen road exists specifically because it has almost no friction. A machine or a cart built to move hundreds of tons exists specifically to overpower that friction going forward. Put both of those facts on a single downhill grade, and you have built, on purpose, a machine for killing the men operating it. Right up until something replaced the entire system from the ground up. Add it all together. The hundreds of horses every winter, the steersmen who didn't stay with her, the road monkeys caught wrong on a hill, the Sams who never made it to their own weddings, and the true human cost of frozen logging roads was never a single dramatic number anybody totaled up in a ledger. It was a slow, grinding toll paid out one camp, one hill, and one winter at a time, for the better part of 50 years. But the very system that was killing men this efficiently was also, without anyone quite intending it, about to make itself obsolete. The road that let the machine age. So what did all of this actually accomplish? In raw economic terms, the frozen logging road and the steam haulers that ran on it kept the American timber industry profitable during exactly the decades when the easiest riverside stands of pine had already been cut clean. Without a system for moving heavy logs miles from the nearest water, vast stretches of the upper Midwest and northern Maine simply would not have been harvested when they were, and the demand for lumber driving cities and railroads westward would have hit a wall years earlier than it did. The houses, the railroads, the cities built out of that lumber in the early 20th century owe a debt to a frozen rut of ice that nobody driving past it today would ever notice. And to every steersman, road monkey, and teamster who paid for that profit margin with frostbite, with a runaway sled, or, like Big Sam, with his life. But the legacy that actually outlived the logging industry wasn't the lumber, it was the tracks. Alvin Lombard's continuous track design, patented in 1901 specifically to haul timber over snow, became the first commercially successful application of that idea anywhere in the world. Within little more than a decade, the same basic principle, distributing enormous weight across an articulated steel tread instead of wheels, was being adapted for an entirely different kind of machine. Military engineers building the first tanks of the First World War drew on exactly this kind of track technology to move armored vehicles across broken, impassable ground. So did the agricultural and construction tractors that followed in peacetime. A machine built to drag pine logs through the Maine woods turned out to be a direct ancestor of the bulldozer, the crawler tractor, and the tank, recognized formally in 1982, when the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated the Lombard Steam Log Hauler a National Historic Mechanical Engineering landmark. The reach of that legacy went further than anyone in the Maine woods could have imagined. Decades later, When engineers needed a name to honor the first serious study of how heavy vehicles move across snow and ice, they named a peak in Antarctica Mount Lombard, after a blacksmith from Waterville who'd never seen snow that didn't melt by April. What replaced the beast itself came faster than anyone in 1901 could have guessed. Lombard began building gasoline-power haulers as early as 1914, trading raw pulling power for simplicity. A gas Lombard could only manage about 5 sleds where a steam machine handled 12, but it didn't need 4 hours to raise steam before the first haul of the morning. None of that made the downgrades any less dangerous. A gas-powered hauler still had no brakes worth trusting, and the same hills that had claimed steam-era steersmen kept claiming gas-era ones for years afterward. A single diesel-powered Lombard rolled out in 1934, the last of its kind, by which point trucks were already creeping into the timber country, sliding on the same treacherous grades the haulers once owned. By the 1940s and into the 1950s, motorized trucks and the new wheeled skidder had taken over the job completely, and the ice roads that once stretched for miles through the North Woods were simply left to thaw for the last time and never get rebuilt. Of the 83 steam log haulers Alvin Lombard built in his Waterville factory between 1901 and 1917, only a handful survive today. A few sit preserved and occasionally fired up for visitors at the Maine Forest and Logging Museum and the Lumberman's Museum in Patten, Maine, rare working ghosts of a machine that once made a sound loggers swore carried for miles across a frozen lake at midnight. Most of the rest were cut up for scrap during the Second World War, or simply abandoned where they broke down for the last time, swallowed by 60 years of new forest growing up silently around their rusted, frozen tracks. And the danger that defined this entire chapter of American industry never really left the trade at all. Logging today still carries one of the highest fatality rates of any job in the country. By some measures, the single most dangerous occupation in America, with a death rate dozens of times higher than the national average across all professions, well ahead of fishing, roofing, or piloting aircraft for a living. The machines have changed beyond recognition. Hydraulic processors with climate-controlled cabs, computer-optimized cutting heads, skidders that would have looked like science fiction to a steersman freezing on a Lombard's front platform. The men no longer ride exposed steering platforms through 40 below nights with sparks landing on their coats. But the same blunt truth Alvin Lombard's steersman understood instinctively, standing on an unbraked machine at the top of a downhill grade, still holds. Moving enormous weight through unforgiving country has never been, and will probably never be, entirely safe. Modern loggers reportedly take the title with a strange kind of pride, the way men in dangerous trades often do. Proof, they'll tell you, of exactly how tough the job demands you be. The same pride a stay-with-her man would have understood without needing it explained. We look at an old photograph of a steam hauler dragging 8 sleds of pine logs across a frozen Maine lake and see a quaint, almost charming piece of industrial history. What we should see instead is one of the most dangerous transportation systems this country ever built on purpose. A road made out of something that melts, carrying machines with no way to stop, run by men who got paid to gamble their lives on a hill holding steady one more time. The pine they hauled built towns. The tracks they perfected built tanks and bulldozers and everything that followed. The roads themselves left behind nothing you could point a camera at. No rails, no pavement, nothing but a faint scar in the forest floor that's long since grown back over. They don't build roads like that anymore. They don't need to. But the ice remembers exactly what it cost the first time around. And somewhere above the Jordan River Valley, so does a hill that still answers to a dead man's name.